So on behalf of the Francis Well Foundation, I want to welcome all of you and to thank Professor Aguillon for accepting to speak to us now. Professor Aguillon is professor at Collège de France, London School of Economics, Harvard, and the MBA, HEC MBA. He authored many papers, many major economic papers, and is #1 in the ranking of H-Connection. He was also, that maybe you don't know, very instrumental in the economic agenda of President Macron. Philippe, your book just came out, The Power of Creative Destruction, Innovation, Growth, and Future of Capitalism. This book is fabulous because it allows everyone, and I want to stress everyone, somebody who has no background, economic background like myself, to better understand the development of the world. And it sheds a new light on society. And I think it's critical to protect democracy. Philippe, you are going to speak 40 minutes, about 40 minutes to answer Q&A. You can, participants can write their Q&A on the side, and you shall answer the question. Okay, so we can start, and Philippe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I will share screen if you don't mind.
Sure.
I will just show this. Can you see the slides there? Can you see it?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, slideshow. Okay, very good. Okay. So, so this book, in fact, is joint work with two young researchers, Céline Antonin and Simon Bunel. They both took my class at Collège de France, and this book, in fact, is a result of first, I mean, the research that I started in 1987 with Peter Howitt. When I was starting as an assistant professor at MIT, and Peter Howitt was visiting from Western Ontario that academic year, and we decided to develop a new growth theory based on some intuitions from Schumpeter. The basic ideas are that long-run growth are driven by innovation, by a cumulative process of innovation. Second idea is that innovation do not come from heaven. They are the results, in particular, of R&D and other type of investments that are motivated by the prospect of monopoly rents from innovation. And three, that creative destruction, new innovations displace old technologies. So those were just ideas. We just made them into a theory, which we now refer to as Schumpeterian growth theory. For example, in Israel, Elhanan Helpman with Jim Grossman have worked on this theory as well, but there have been many other followers of what we did with Peter Howitt. And that theory has been confronted to data. So there's been, now there is a whole new generation of economists, Ufuk Aksil, Chicago, then you have Pete Klino, who is in Stanford, Timo Boppard, who is in Stockholm, and you have a whole new generation of economists and who are now working on this, based on this Schumpeterian growth theory. Okay, so we developed that theory, and out of the research that we did and that many other, our followers and followers of followers have done, that's what I've been teaching over the past 5 years at Collège de France. And at Collège de France, you teach the public. So you teach an audience which is non-economist, most of them. And so you have to make recent research accessible to non-economists, to non-specialists. And out of 5 years of slides and work on that, and Simon and Céline were instrumental in helping me put together the slides, and we had a set of a whole corpus of knowledge. But then what we did is to focus it and to complete it around the theme, the power of creative destruction. And that's the French book, but there is now the English version, which is called The Power of Creative Destruction, is coming out at HUP, Harvard University Press, in April. I should say. So in April, on April 20th, you will have the English version published. But the book is now being translated in Spanish, in Chinese, in Japanese, in Korean, in Portuguese. And so we have a number of translations of the book that are ongoing. So creative destruction is the process whereby new innovation displaces old technologies. The notion, as I said, was formulated by Schumpeter, in particular in his book Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. But then we made it into a theory, and then we made it into a theory that we confronted with data. So let me just continue. Now there is, at the heart of this theory, there is a contradiction, because on the one hand, innovation is motivated by prospects of monopoly rents. That's why you want to invest in, we like also do research for the purpose of research. But it's true that true innovations have been very much linked to institutions that protected property rights and guaranteed monopoly rents to the innovator. But on the other hand, the rents can be used ex post by yesterday's innovators to prevent future innovation, precisely because there is creative destruction. If I innovated yesterday and I got rents thanks to that, I may want to use my rents to block new entry and new innovation. So that contradiction is made Schumpeter pessimistic. Schumpeter believed that you would have a first wave of innovation, but then those guys would turn into conglomerates that would block any future innovation. So he thought that capitalism was doomed because there was no way out of that. Instead, we think there is a way out, which we call optimisme de combat, the optimism of the fighter. And we think that there is a way out, that the state and civil society can together make sure that we don't get trapped into the fact that yesterday's innovators would stall any future innovation. Okay? So that's the main theme of the book. And that contradiction runs through the whole book, actually. Okay? So now, before I move on, let me just say that creative destruction is not just a concept, it's something you can measure. So, for example, here is work by Ufuk Akfigit and John Grigsby and Tom Nicholas on American ingenuity. And what they show, they do, here you have a cross US state regression, a cross section, where, on the horizontal axis, you have the average number, you have the average yearly flow of patents between 1900 and 2000. And on the vertical axis, you have the average annual growth of per capita GDP between 1900 and 2000. And you see that if you have to run, if you do an OLS, you get an increasing relationship. You have between a number of patents and growth, and the measure of creative destruction here is the number of new patents, which is a measure of new entry. In fact, they show that this relationship is not just a correlation, but in fact it's the instrument for the number of patents, and they show that you have a causal effect of new patents on new innovation on growth. Another way to look at creative destruction is to look at the firm life cycle. So we know, for example, that when a firm is very young, you have a very high growth rate of employment. But the growth rate of employment goes down to zero, and at some moment, the firm stabilizes its employment. That's a very interesting fact about firms that plays out in the book a lot. There is another thing also to look at is the rate at which you exit. And we see that young firms exit much more than old firms. So those are interesting facts that have to do with creative destruction at the firm level, which play out a lot in this book as well. Okay? And then, you have a very obvious measure of creative destruction, which is the rate of turnover. How much job destruction and job creation you have in one period, or how much firm destruction and firm creation you have. And you would find always that you have a positive relationship between creative destruction measured by turnover of jobs or turnover of firms on the horizontal axis and the per capita GDP growth on the vertical axis. Okay? So that's just to get you a sense that creative destruction is not just a concept, it's something that you can measure in various ways, and the various ways are consistent with one another. Now, the thing is that what the book does is that it uses the lens of creative destruction to do three main things. One is to talk about, to revisit some main enigmas of economic history. The second thing the book does is to question some common wisdoms, which we think to be not, to be unwarranted wisdoms, unjustified wisdoms. And the third thing that the book does is to help us rethink the future of capitalism. So let me turn to each of them in turn. Let me drink some water first. The first enigma is the industrial takeoff. You see, if you look here, you see that essentially there's been ups and downs, but essentially GDP per capita takes off worldwide in starting in the 19th century. You see, before the early 19th century, there isn't much going on. And here, yeah. So that's the thing. So it's a recent phenomenon, growth. You had essentially no growth in world GDP or in per capita GDP until sustained growth. It's true you have some episodes of growth here and there. They never last for long. So the true takeoff and the durable takeoff of growth is a very recent, it's just 200 years old, which compared to human history is nothing. And of course the question is, why did it happen that late? Why did it happen in Europe? And not in China, where you had many inventors since Middle Age and before. It's in China that the wheel was invented, that the compass was invented. They have many big inventions in China, but that's not there. It is not there that industrial takeoff took place. So why is that? Why so late, and why in Europe? Okay, and that's an enigma that we take up in chapter 2 of the book. And what's nice is that it really illustrates, the most convincing explanation illustrates the Schumpeterian paradigm. And Joël Mokyr there is a key figure, and you know Joël Mokyr because Joël is both at Northwestern, but he's also professor at Tel Aviv. And Joël tells you that, you know, of course, it's about cumulative innovation. So it's about the fact that you had openness. It was important to access knowledge. So printing helped it first, printed, and the encyclopedia made it possible to codify knowledge. Therefore, you would avoid the Sisyph myth because you could build on previous knowledge. You see, so cumulative innovation process very important. Second, it was very important to have revolutions. In England, you had the Glorious Revolution. In France, you had the French Revolution that made it possible to set up a property right protection system that was conducive to innovation. And the third element is competition, is that, of course, in China, the big problem is that you know, emperors were aware of creative destruction, and they were aware that their own power could be destroyed by innovation. So they would always prevent innovation. But in Europe, because you have competing countries, if a country A persecutes a researcher or scientist, the scientist could go to country B, and then country B becomes more advanced than country A. But then, because the countries compete with each other, that would help the takeoff. You see what I mean? So that completely illustrates the paradigm: cumulative innovation, property right protection, and how you make creative destruction happen. In Europe, it happened because of competition among European countries. So this is the first enigma, the industrial takeoff. The second enigma is technological revolutions. You have waves, you see. So here, the US, that's the wave of the, you have the wave of the electricity, then you have the wave of IT, you have various waves, you see what I mean? That's US, so sorry, that's wave of electricity, and that's the wave of IT. And you have various waves. Each time you had the technological wave, there was a fear that it would destroy employment more than it would create employment. But we never observed that employment was destroyed so much. I mean, we never observed mass unemployment as a result of the steam engine revolution. You remember you had the Luddites movement in England because they were fearing mass unemployment. When you had the electricity wave Keynes was, predicting mass unemployment in the US. Never it happened. And today, some people predict mass unemployment due to robotization and automation and AI, and it's not happening for the moment. You see, and so we explain in the book why it's not the case. And it's not the case because, in fact, when you automate, firms that automate become more productive, and therefore they increase their market for their products. And because they increase the market for their products, they can keep hiring. And that's something, and that productivity effect more than compensates the substitution effect of man by machines. And that's, we show that, I will show you some pictures in a moment, but that we believe explain largely why none of the major technological revolutions generated mass unemployment. Another enigma is a secular stagnation. What you see is that in the US, TFP growth, you see, had increased a lot between 1995 and 2005, but then it's now lower. It went down in the latest period. And people want to understand why did it go down that much? And there are various explanations for the secular stagnation. Is it because ideas are harder to find than they used to? Is it because we don't know how to measure growth? Indeed, we don't know how to measure productivity growth, in part because of productivity structure. And in fact, we underestimate growth. Growth is at least 0.6, 0.7 per year higher than we believe because we don't know how to measure productivity structure. That's true, but that's not enough to explain this big decline between here and here. And there we believe that the big explanation is that the IT revolution allowed superstar firms to emerge, like the Amazon, like the FAMAN, or the GAFAM, we say in French, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Walmart, and all that. And those firms, so when they became pervasive, initially TFP growth increased because these firms were more productive than other firms. But then when they invaded the whole American economy, they inhibited innovation by others. And that's why growth went down. And so very much it's a problem of competition. We allowed these firms to do merger and acquisition without any limit, whereas we should have adapted competition policy to the digital era to limit the extent to which these firms could dominate the whole economy and stall innovation and growth in the US economy. So that we discuss that a lot in the book. Another enigma is middle income trap. The middle income trap is that you see Argentina, that's the per capita GDP of Argentina. You see compared to US, it was always like, stationary with US. You see what I mean? And but then it becomes decreasing. You see, so for a while, Argentina, it was not quite at the level of per capita GDP of the US, but the growth rate of per capita GDP in Argentina between 1870 and 1830 was pretty much the same as it was in US. Well, it was doing very well, but then Argentina stopped doing well. And we try to understand the various countries, not just middle-income countries, but also a country like Japan is very interesting. Japan is an advanced country. It was growing very fast up to the late 80s, and since then stopped growing. Korea is an example of a country that grew very fast and doesn't grow as much. So we believe that the story is again very Schumpeterian. During the catching up phase, you see, for example, Argentina or Korea or Japan were catching up, and during the catching up phase, they developed big conglomerates. They are called keiretsus in Japan, they are called shoguns in Korea. They became very big. And those, to go to do frontier innovation, you see, you have two ways to grow. You can either imitate the frontier technology, that's what you do when you are catching up country, or you innovate on yourself, you do what we call frontier innovation, when you are a frontier country, like US or OECD countries. And the problem is that these countries that were catching up, they had institutions that were adapted to catching up, but once they became frontier economies, they did not adapt their institutions to become, to do frontier innovation. You know, when you do frontier innovation, you need much more competition. That's very important. I compete, when you have competition, I innovate to do better than you do. You need more flexible labor markets. You need financial systems that are more towards equity financing. So you need a whole organization of the economy, different when you are about doing frontier innovation than when you do catching up. And the problem is that the conglomerates that grew during the catching up period, not only they prevent new entry, but they prevent governments from changing their institutions. They buy out governments. You see, they collude with governments. So Japan is a country where you have huge collusion between government and large firms. The French know about that, okay? So, that collusion makes it very difficult to move into more innovation enhancing institutions. And we believe that that explanation, that explains very much why you have this. It's again a Schumpeterian phenomenon, is that the innovators of yesterday, not only they use their rents to stop new entry, but they use their rents to bribe governments into not changing their institutions to become innovation-based growth countries. You see, that's another one. So there is so that those are among those are about examples of enigma. Now I said the second thing that the book does is to question common wisdoms. For example, there are people who believe that taxing robots is good for employment. So that's not true, because I told you before. In fact, we just did with the same authors plus Xavier Jaravel, we did a study, plant level and farm level data, from French level data, where we showed that automation, if you automate at day zero, you create employment. You see, you don't reduce employment. And you have an elasticity of employment to automation of 0.2 on impact at the time you increase your automation. But in the long run, it's an elasticity which is twice as big. So automation induces right away an increase in employment, but even more in the long run. And in fact, firms that do not automate, they exit more. You see, so that's interesting, because in fact, what happens is exactly what I said before. Firms that automate, it's true they may replace some labor with machines, but on the other hand, they become more productive, and therefore they increase their market share worldwide, and therefore they increase the demand for their product, and therefore they increase employment. And that productivity effect more than counteracts, more than offsets the substitution effect. And therefore it's a bad idea to tax robots, because if you tax robots, you prevent firms from innovating, from doing these improvements that would create employment. So it's certainly not something you want to do. Another common wisdom is that taxation is the main instrument to make growth more inclusive. I believe in taxation. I believe you need taxation to finance education. You need taxation to finance access to health. So you need taxation. It's certainly one instrument to make growth inclusive. You also need taxation to redistribute. So I don't deny, but it's not the only instrument. In a country like France, for example, where already taxation is very high, there are other instruments, there are other levers to make growth more inclusive in addition to taxation. One of them is to create good jobs. So here what I show is that I show on the left-hand side the evolution of the wage of an unskilled worker working in a more innovative firms or less innovative firms. And what you see is that more innovative firms, they tend to give more, they tend to provide more what we call good jobs, which are jobs which train the worker, which give more tenure to the worker, which give more prospects for wage increase over the lifetime of the worker. So innovation has this virtue that it favors social mobility, in particular because innovative firms create more good jobs. Because more innovative firms, you need also good secretary. You need, because a good secretary completes, is a complement to the other assets of the firm. And innovative firms, it would be very bad in a more innovative firms to have a secretary, an assistant who screws up, because he would screw up a lot of things. You see what I mean? And that's why innovation is also an instrument for social mobility. Creative destruction is another reason. Creative destruction means that you have new people replacing old people. So overtaxing capital can be dangerous if it discourages innovation. So it's good to have taxation. I believe in taxation, but to make sure that you don't discourage innovation, because innovation has the power of also improving social mobility of workers at all stages. That I look here at workers which have low education level to start with, but they are trained in firms, and more innovative firms train more even low educated workers. Okay. So, so another wisdom is that protectionism is the way to regain control. Do like Donald Trump, put tariffs everywhere. And you see, that's very interesting. I show here anti-COVID products. So those are respirators, active principles, masks, and all that. You see, in these products, and those are the export and imports of Germany, and those are the export and imports of France. You see that in the early 2000s, Germany and France were almost the same. And you see that nowadays, Germany is a much bigger exporter and importer of these products. And in fact, it has even a big excess of export over import. It has a surplus of 20 billion euros in just these respirators, active principles, and masks. Whereas France has almost zero, surplus, trade surplus. And Germany achieved that essentially by innovating. It's not by putting tariffs. They did that because they had an industrial policy and a policy of innovation. And so what we explain in chapter 13 of the book is that really innovation is the best way. If you do tariff, the problem is that the country that is subject to your tariff will retaliate, will close its markets to you. And we know that exporting is a source of innovation. So we shoot ourselves in the feet if we rely mainly on tariffs, because there is a risk that the other country will retaliate, that you will engage in a trade war. And we know trade wars are very bad for innovation because it restricts the size of the markets. And we know a bigger market size means more runs to innovating. So we know that having a new export market encourages firms to innovate. And Germany is an example of a country that does very well on trade, through innovation, much more than through tariffs. Okay. Then there is the view that zero or negative growth is the best response to climate. No, because when you are in a world with innovation, green innovation is the solution. So you have to make firms innovate green. How do you induce firms to innovate green? With carbon tax, but also through subsidies to green R&D and through industrial policy, which is geared towards clean technologies. In France, for example, you have the nuclear plants and the hydroelectric plants. That's why France is only responsible for 1% of the world CO2 emissions, a lot because of this industrial policy. But of course, the carbon tax and subsidies to clean R&D are also important instruments. Okay, and so now I turn to the last part, which is rethink capitalism. Rethink capitalism. COVID was a revelator. COVID showed that the social model in the US is broken, but it also showed that in Europe we are not as good as the US for innovation. So let me just show you that. That's it. I put in French. I will put the English slides to Muriel that I will send after this. This shows the comparison between US, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and France in terms of the Gini. Gini is the global measure of inequality. Is a global measure of how far apart we are from total equality. If we have a Gini of 0, it means that everybody earns the same. If we have a Gini of 1, it means that we are very unequal. You see that US is more unequal than Germany, Sweden, Norway, France, and Denmark. So it's a more unequal country, US. If you look at poverty rates, you see again that US has a higher poverty rate than Germany, Sweden, Norway, France, and Denmark. Okay. Now there is another thing: is that COVID, when COVID occurred, when you had in March, the unemployment rate went up a lot in the US. But the problem in the US, when you become unemployed, you lose. You are likely to lose health coverage, or at least part of the health coverage, and that's the fraction of Americans without health coverage. It increased a lot during the COVID crisis, and whereas in Germany, everybody has health coverage, like in France. You see, so you see how against a big shock like COVID, US is very bad at insuring its citizens. What I showed, so here is US versus France. US versus Italy, US versus Spain, US versus UK, and all the European countries are more or less the same, and US is very bad socially. That shows the fraction of people at the threshold of poverty. You see that unemployment goes up in the US, and you see poverty rates goes up a lot in the US. But in Germany, the poverty rate did not increase with COVID. It remained the same. So that's another instance in which another measure reflecting that Germany or the Scandinavian countries or European countries do a much better job than US at insuring against a shock like COVID. Okay. Now, on the other hand, that's the downside of the US. They have a very bad social model that does not insure. My colleague Acemoglu and Robinson call about cutthroat capitalism. On the other hand, compared to what they call cozy or cuddly capitalism, which would be more the Scandinavian. But on the other hand, the US are much better on innovation. You see here the biotech patents per million inhabitants. It's almost 3 times as much, between 2 and 3 times as much in the US than in the EU 27. And the US average is much higher than the OECD average. So you see, US are much better in generating patents than we are. And that's from various reasons. First, because basic research is very well funded, in particular in biotech in the US. They have NSF, they have the National Institute of Health, they have the Mécénat, the donors, HHMI, which is sponsors, private sponsors to research. They have also what they call the BARDA. BARDA is the equivalent of DARPA. Alors, let me tell you what DARPA was. DARPA stands for Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. It was created during the Cold War because for tough technologies, where US was racing with the Soviet Union, you had to put a man in space, you had to develop technologies where the basic research had been done, but the application were not there. And sometimes to get from basic research to application, you need to coordinate large resources. And it's very hard to do that. So in the US, they did that for defense by the DARPA. And so NASA and all that is a consequence of DARPA. Okay? The laser, the GPS, all those things are corollaries of the DARPA. Then the US created the ARPA Energy, which is a DARPA for energy. And then more recently, they created the BARDA, Biologic Advanced Research Development Agency. And you see that to fight COVID, in particular vaccines, you see, look all what they invested. It's enormous, $10 billion in the US vaccine, investment of BARDA for vaccines. And that's why they are so good in vaccines. Pfizer and all these guys, that's very much financed by associating with BARDA. Okay, compared to BARDA, Europe is much less. If you total European Commission funding and EIB funding, you get to 3 times less than the US. So the US, they have a much better ecosystem. They have the basic research. They have the BARDA and DARPA. They have venture capitalists, much more developed than in Europe. They have institutional investors. I know many of those things are well developed in Israel. So I would not put Israel with Europe. I think Israel is closer probably to US as far as innovation is concerned. But the rest of Europe is very much behind the US in terms of innovation. So what you want is you want a capitalist system that combines the good aspects of both. I want the innovations of the US and I want the social model of the Scandinavian. And I believe that can be done. And in fact, when Denmark introduced the flex security system, which means that when you lose your job, the firm has flexibility in dismissing workers, but then the worker has income insurance and insured training, and then you can rebound to a new job. It's a very efficient system, the flex security in the US. That made innovation easier to happen in Denmark, but it also makes social protection better in Denmark. When you lose your job in Denmark, there is no consequence on health. I have Alexandra Roulet, who is my colleague, had a very important paper showing that there is no health consequence in Denmark of losing your job, whereas there are dramatic consequences of losing your job on health in the US. So it's there is very good hope that we can combine the good aspect of the American model, which is to be more innovative, and the good aspect of the European model to be more protective. I think what's key in all that is the triangle between, you see here, let me show the triangle between the market, the firms, the state and the civil society. You need the firms because innovation occurs in the firm sector mainly. And you need competition and you need all that. You need the market and the firms. You need the state because to protect the state is very important, but also to invest as an investor in health and education, also as an insurer against shocks like COVID, or to move the flex security system. So you need the state there. But you also need civil society. Civil society first is there to make sure that there is no collusion between the state and the market. I mentioned before some countries where you have this big collusion between conglomerates and the state. When you have a more active civil society, the civil society can denounce, in particular the media play a big role there. It's very important, the unions play a role, the association play a role to denounce, scandals, corrupt politicians and all that, which are all about the collusion between firms and state. And you know that the collusion is bad because it's to prevent new innovation. It's always the same dilemma, the same contradiction that runs through the whole book. So the civil society is key to make sure, as a watchdog, to make sure that this type of collusion, the scope of this collusion between firms and state will be minimized. And that's why I think the key to a capitalist system that will be successful is to have a very vibrant triangle between markets, the state, and civil society. So now, let me just tell you the organization of the book, the outline. We start by putting up the paradigm and the measurement of creative destruction. So the Schumpeterian paradigm, we compare with the neoclassical paradigm. We explain that the neoclassical paradigm cannot talk about the enigma that I mentioned, whereas the Schumpeterian paradigm can talk about these enigmas. And we talk about how to measure creative destruction and the outline of the book. Chapter 2 talks about the takeoff, enigma. The chapter 3 talks about the technological wave enigma, why technological revolution, why waves come with delay, and why technological revolutions do not lead to mass unemployment. Chapter 4 talks about competition and innovation, the relationship between competition. Is competition good or bad for growth? Why is the decline of growth in the US have to do with declining competition? So we really talk about competition. What is the interplay between competition and industrial policy? Should we renounce all industrial policy in the name of competition? Or is there complementarity between competition and industrial policy? All that is done in chapter 4. Chapter 5 talks about inequality. We show that, in fact, that's why we argue that the tax is not the only way to make growth more inclusive. We show that innovation, it's true that innovators, innovation increase the top 1% share of income because innovators get grants. But on the other hand, innovation fosters social mobility. And therefore, we distinguish innovation as a source of top income inequality from lobbying, for example, which is a bad source of top income inequality. So we really look at the conundrum between inequality and inequality, competition, and innovation there. Then we move to the secular stagnation, explaining the growth decline in the US. Is it because ideas become harder to find? Is it because growth is mismeasured? Is it the superstar? And we talk about that there. Then we have the middle income trap in chapter 7. Then we talk about structural change. Countries usually go from agriculture to industry to services. But some countries manage to go directly from agriculture to services. Why can that be possible? And we talk about that here, okay? Then we talk about green innovation and reconciling innovation and fighting climate change, how you do that, which instrument. We talk about energy transition there as well. Then we talk about the behind the scene of innovation. The innovators, who are their families, which kind of social background do they have? What is the income of their parents? What is the profession of their parents? How do you articulate basic research and applied research? Okay, and why basic research is better done in universities and applied research better done in firms. All that is looked at in chapter 10. In chapter 11, we look at the relationship between creative destruction, health, and happiness. And that's what we do there. And that's where we contrast between Denmark and the US in particular. Okay, then we talk about financing creative destruction. That's where we explain all the ecosystem of innovation in the US and why this ecosystem is not there in Europe. Then we talk about globalization, why protectionism is not the way out, to react to the China joining WTO or to an import shock. And we compare between the tariff strategy and the innovation strategy, and we discuss all that in the globalization. Then we have historically how the investor state and insurer state emerged, how the wars, because France, for example, invested a lot in education because you had we lost to Germany in Sedan in 1870, and that's why Jules Ferry came up and invested a lot in education in France, and we had all the French schooling system. So wars have been big drivers of investment of the state in education. But also crises have been big drivers of state investment in insurance. And so the emergence of the welfare state and the counter-cyclical policies is discussed in that chapter. And then we discuss the limit of the state, why the state cannot do it alone, and why you also need civil society. That's discussed in chapter 15. And at the end, I discuss the future of capitalism, and based on the whole book. And that's the outline. So I think I will stop there. Thank you very much. I think that's all I wanted to do to present the book. Okay.
Okay, Philippe, thank you so much. It was really a fascinating talk and a lot of thoughts for thinking. I would like to ask you one question. When you speak about combine the two good sides of social protection and the American way, my question, is it possible, doesn't it take two different mindsets? One being more risk-taking, meaning the American one, the Israeli one, and the European one is much less risk-taking. And does innovation at that request more risk-taking? Is it not one of the reasons it's so different between the two worlds?
My answer, Muriel, why I'm an optimist there, is that when the Danish introduced flexi-security, they made people become more risk-takers. When you are skiing, if you are trained in skiing, you will not fear a black slope. When you are not trained, you fear black slope. So it's the same with flex security. When you have a safety net, you take more risk actually. So that's what was great with the flexi security. It induced more risk taking. Innovation went up in Denmark, and also protection improved. So that's the kind of things I think which are very important. Noam Harari, is from in Israel and wrote this book that everybody has read on Sapiens and other things. He talks about also artificial intelligence in a recent book. And he also, defends the view that if you had a better system, for example, to insure the young people, you see what I mean? They would take more risks. You kind of universal income for the young, conditional on their, working a bit, and conditional on, doing. They would take more risk. You see what I mean? Safety net. There is always the view that you think you give to people, they will become lazy. That's not true, Muriel.
I'm not speaking about laziness. I'm not speaking about laziness.
It can have the effect of making you take more risk, actually.
Okay. I was just asking because in France we have a very good social network and we are not very risk-taking.
Yeah, but we don't have a good security system. That's the problem. That's true. In France, we haven't found it. You're absolutely right.
And the second question, from an economic point of view, what do you think it's going to be after the COVID crisis? Because we are hopefully heading at the end of it with the vaccination, but how you see the future? What are the major changes?
So look, I mean, I don't know for sure. I know, there are things that will go back to where they were, but there are things that will not quite go back to where they were. You know, I will not fly nearly as much as I used to fly. That's for sure. Now I discovered Zoom. Before I go to a conference, I will think twice or even 3 times before I go to a conference with all the stress that traveling implies. I don't see myself going more than once a year to the US for the NBA, National Bureau of Economic Research Summer Institute maybe, and that's the most I would do. Or maybe to work with a co-author, but even that you can do a lot now with, you know, by computer. So I will really, and I think people will also telework a bit more. I think medical consultations, we might do more also through online, you know, so I think there are things that will change. There are things that will go back to what they were, but there are things that will change. And so there will be a mixture of the two. And also, for example, for a country like France, COVID, as I said, showed us that we had outsourced too much. And I think we should invest more in innovation and new firms. So that there will be new activities there. So if it can induce a country like France to have DARPAs and BARDAs and be active, that will be a good thing. That will be a difference between that things that should have been done anyway. So my hope, you see, that as I said, COVID revealed problems that we already had. We were probably flying too much, okay, which is bad for the environment. I think each time you cross the Atlantic, you know, you contribute badly to CO2 emission. We were not innovating enough in Europe, particularly. The US social model has to be reformed. So my hope is that those things should have been done anyway. But COVID, hopefully, will have pointed to the dramatic, you know, consequences of delaying further changes that should have been made even before COVID.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Can you write them down on the question Q&A session? Meanwhile, I have, if you accept, Philippe, another question about the debt. The debt. People are saying, okay, why we don't just off the debt?
Yeah,
so
right off the debt. So
yeah.
there, I think, I mean, look, there I venture some answer, and of course with a lot of humility, because I'm not specialized in the debt. One thing is important is to say that probably part of the debt will be monetized or will be, you know, postponed. Certainly part of that debt will be, but that will not solve the whole problem. I think also it's important to, another consideration is that important that whatever you do, you don't do it at the expense of growth. Olivier Blanchard has this very important work where he shows that it's very important that G, the rate of growth, be greater than the rate of interest. Because then debt is more sustainable when you have a rate of growth which is higher than the rate of interest. So don't do anything that would damage your growth. So growth is part of the solution, but it's not the only part of the solution. In a country like France, we need to work more. The French don't work enough. Now, the problem is that, of course, in my job, in my type of job, for example, Collège de France, we would retire at 7:00. Now we will retire at 7:03. And in the US, you know that academics don't never retire, okay? So I think in this kind of job, you can work longer. In other jobs where you work in a, you know, in a chemical factory, there you cannot because you die, you know what I mean? So there are jobs which are very tough jobs where there you can't have the people work longer. So you have to think about maybe they can go into something else where there it will be easier to work longer. So you have to think the problem of we should work a bit more, but do it in a way which is you know, which is fair. You see what I mean? And which is fair to people who are in the low life expectancy jobs. And because always a danger where, for example, you delay retirement age is that it's usually a transfer from the low skill who start working early and have lower life expectation into those who start working late with high life expectation. So you have to deal with this problem of working more in a way which is fair, which also, maybe also when we telework, work will be nicer, you see what I mean? And maybe then we can envisage to work more when part of the work is done at home, you see. So those are things to be thought about. And that might be a way also to look. Another way to think is that France, for example, has to reform the state or the retirement system, but we have too many levels of government in France where we duplicate tasks. Alain Juppé was former prime minister, said that to negotiate the high-speed train between Paris and Bordeaux, he had to talk to 50 people. Did he need really 50 people at his table to do that? No. So there you can cut and cut and cut, okay? And there is another thing is that you might think of, for example, compulsory borrowing, emprunt obligatoire. You see what I mean? You could have state bonds. You see what I mean? That wealthier people must subscribe. That could be another way also too. So one can think of various ways to deal with the debt. Partly it will be postponed, partly will be the growth, partly we should work more, that we have to rethink how we work, and partly things like possibly, debt issuance by the state, which is done in a way which is redistributive. So there are ways there. Those are just ideas. It's by no way exhaustive, and you have to know, there must be a debate on how you implement that.
Okay, thank you. The first question is, what do you think about the idea of innovation stability chair with 3 feet, employment and social protection and stability, comparative innovation investment choice, education to issue innovation enablers and users?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a complementarity between education policy and R&D policy. If you have an uneducated population, there is no innovation. There is very interesting work by Ufuk Eksigit again, one of my co-author and disciple, but now Ufuk is Ufuk, and he has his own disciples. That's what's nice in this profession. Ufuk has many disciples now, where he shows that, you need to have education first. So, for example, a low-income country, prior to doing R&D subsidies, they should invest in education if they want to innovate. Once you have an educated population, then you can move into R&D subsidies. You see what I mean? So those things are very complementary. And of course, it's also very important to have to stabilize the cycle. If you are in a very uncertain environment, their firms do not invest in innovation. That's why it's very important to avoid the third wave of COVID, because it's very bad to have lockdown, unlock, lock, unlock, lock, unlock, where you never know where you lock and where you unlock. That's the worst of the worst for innovation. So it's very important that even before we have the vaccine full scale, we avoid a third wave of COVID, because it's very important that firms face a low uncertainty environment. When firms face high uncertainty, they are on a survival mode. They are not on a long-term innovation mode. So it's very important and that's why automatic stabilizers are very important. And that's why flex security is very important, because those mechanisms help. That's why small business acts are very important, because they insure over the cycle. And that's very important to favor innovation. So for innovation, you need education. You need counter-cyclical policies that make sure that you smooth out the cycle, because firms that face too much uncertainty, they don't innovate. And you need, of course, R&D policy.
Okay, thank you. Another comment. In France, many of the people who have worked in private companies work a lot and have a good productivity. The problem is the size of public jobs and high unemployment with unskilled people. Can you comment?
Yeah, you're right. The big problem is unskilled people. So that's why first it's important to improve our education system. So in France, for example, we used to have a very good education system, but the problem is that now performance at PISA in France is very much linked to social origin. So we need to do that. And we need in zones which are, high migration zone or suburban zone, we need to put much more resources than elsewhere. So that has to be done. And it starts to being done by the current Minister of Education. So education is the number one. If you don't have the education, nowhere there. But then it's very important to have a good training system. So in France, we used to have a terrible training system. We now have a reform of the training system. But also I mentioned in my talk the good jobs. So we know that even low educated workers can be trained by the firms, but that's where also they need to be induced to train. So you have to create the conditions for firms to be induced to train their workers and to provide them better jobs. So in particular, innovation is a way to do that. Subsidies to training is a way to do that. Make sure that you have always educated people everywhere, so that firms always hire educated, that you need other workers to complete or complement. That will be a way to have good jobs. You see, so it's both a policy to make sure that education happens everywhere in the country, to make sure that training is subsidized, and to make sure that innovation is there. If you have those policies, that will also allow the proliferation of good jobs that will, even to people who started with low education, they will learn a lot on the job and have good jobs.
Okay. Any more questions from the audience? I don't see them. Okay, I think we are just, you gave us 1 hour, we are just at the 1 hour, so.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your talk has been recorded, so you will be able to see it and to listen again to it, and to have more answer on the website of the foundation, which is franceisraelfoundation.org. And we can also resend the information on this talk. Okay.
Yeah, just let me thank you, Muriel. You do a fantastic job, you know, to organize this and to all what you do, how you completely revamped the France Israel Foundation. I think you deserve a big applause, Muriel. You're doing a fantastic job. So it's great to be working with you. It's a privilege. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.